So today I will be talking about the women of the Portland Mavericks. This is a really fun story about the convergence of independent baseball, second wave feminism, and a group of women who simply loved baseball. So, first, if you're familiar with the Portland Mavericks, it's probably because of the Battered Bastards of Baseball, which was a Netflix documentary that came out about 10 years ago about the team. They were owned by the actor Bing Russell. He had just finished up a 12-year run on the TV show Bonanza. He wasn't quite sure what to do next, and his son, Kurt Russell, who was a former child actor and a minor league baseball player at the time, suggested he bring a team to Portland. So the Mavericks became the only independent baseball team in the country then. They attracted a wide range of players to their open tryouts. It was a lot of guys who never got a shot in baseball and guys who wanted another shot. Their most prominent player was ball four actor Jim Bouton. He joined the Mavericks hoping to get one more shot at the major leagues. And the Mavericks were a huge success in Portland, largely because of their shenanigans on and off the field, but also because they were a really good baseball team. They broke all the rules and won anyway. So they may seem like a strange team to make a feminist statement. They called their red jerseys Streetwalker Red. Some of their off the field shenanigans involved women. And one player admitted on a podcast that they would not have done too well in the Me Too era. But what they did have was Bing Russell. And although he had hoped to be a baseball player himself and was a huge baseball fan, he wasn't a member of their elite. And he had no intention of following their traditions or doing things the way baseball was always done. And this picture of him here is in a pregame ceremony wearing a Three Stooges outfit. So when Bing had a job he needed done right, he knew exactly who could do it. And that brings us to one of our main characters, Lanny Moss. She was born Janice Moss in Toronto, Canada, and she seems to have gone by Lanny almost exclusively. I'm not sure how she got that nickname, but her parents were in the Salvation Army, so she lived all over the country growing up. And after the 1973 season, she began working with the Mavericks as a bookkeeper. From there, she moved to their sales team and was put in charge of their winter sales drive. And for minor league teams, the advanced ticket sales were a really big deal because that was how they got their money to start the season. So for her to be so successful at that was a really big deal for her and the Mavericks. So at the beginning of the season, she was moved into the front office and given the title of office manager. So in addition to doing the sales and marketing she was doing before, she was in charge of all the administrative tasks for the ballpark. Everyone who talked about her, both when I was interviewing people and in contemporary newspaper quotes, talked about how great she was to work with. She was really good at managing people, and she was also extremely competent and confident in her abilities. So, unlike a lot of the women we'll meet today, she didn't know anything about baseball before joining the Mavericks. She talked about issuing a press release where she called it the seventh ending stretch. But it didn't take long for her time with the Mavericks for her to fall in love with baseball. She talked a lot about enjoying going into the stands during games and sitting with old time fans and just listening to the way they talked about baseball. And in a very 1970s statement, she said of baseball, it's better than any head trip you can go on. So over to the right is a blurb from the 1974 programs. She talks a little bit there about the learning curve and difficulties of being the only women in an office full of men. And she later said that she worked with a lot of chauvinists, but she didn't mind because they wanted the team to succeed as much as she did. So that first year working in the office, Bing went out of town for the second half of the season, and he left her in charge of the entire business side of the team. And when he returned, he was really impressed to find how well the team was running. Up until that point, he had been acting as a general manager, and he recognized how good she was at that job and how much the Mavericks would benefit from her running the team. So he hired her as general manager. And on November 13th, 1974, almost exactly 50 years ago, the Mavericks announced their new general manager. This caused a lot of media attention. There's some examples of headlines from when she was hired. And sports writers at this time clearly had no idea how to write about women. And this was true for all of the women breaking into baseball at this time. They talked about her attractiveness, they wondered about her measurements and how she could possibly manage a team in between making pot roasts and having her hair done. There was also a lot of hand wringing that the women's livers were turning their sights on baseball. The women had been making a lot of ground in all sorts of industries, and baseball was all the men had left. And now they didn't even have that. So it was a rough time for men. But Bing Russell talked her up in the newspapers, and he was adamant that he hired her because she was so good at her job. And he said the fact that she's a girl had nothing to do with the simple premise that I wanted her for the job. The newspapers claimed she was the first woman to ever hold a general manager job in organized baseball. And I think anyone who's done research knows that minor league records are pretty tricky. There's nothing comprehensive about them. And there were absolutely women performing GM roles prior to 1974. There's notably Effa Manley of the Newark Eagles of the Negro National League, which she co-owned along with her husband Abe. And that seems to be the case for most of the women who are doing a general manager type role, is that they either co-own the team or it was a team their husbands owned. So she might have been the first to be hired as a general manager who wasn't related to the team owner. But she did get a lot of attention for it at a time when women were breaking barriers in sports. So as a general manager, Lanny was very competent and creative. One of the first things she did was sell Gene Lanthorn his own contract. He had wanted to pursue a career as a major leaguer, and the Mavericks didn't want to let him go without compensation. So she came up with the idea that he could buy his own contract. So the team was compensated and he could play for whoever he wanted. She was very good with money. She was very good at selling tickets, and she was really well respected by other minor league GMs. She, the Mavericks were a short season A-League team, and they were often outselling really established teams with full seasons and teams that were much higher, like AA and AAA teams. And she was rewarded for that with 2 Northwest League Executive of the Year awards, and she was offered jobs by other minor league teams. Now, of course, she couldn't do this all on her own, so she hired another competent woman to join her, and that was Carren Woods, who's featured prominently in the documentary on the Mavericks. When she joined them, she had just graduated high school and had the rest of her life planned out. She was going to go to the University of Oregon on a scholarship, and she was going to go to law school after that. She grew up a huge baseball fan, And she was working as the head umpire for a softball league in Lake Oswego, Oregon. And when softball season was over, she needed a job, and her boss suggested she work for the Mavericks. So she applied for a bookkeeping job with the Mavericks, and she interviewed with Lanny while Lanny was having her hair done, which is the sort of multitasking you have to do when you're a woman running a baseball team. She and Moss hit it off, and she was hired. So Bing Russell was initially upset that someone so young and with no experience was hired, but she showed her aptitude right away. She was a very hard worker, creative, and competent, just like Lanny was. And along with Lanny, she helped run every aspect of their game day operations. They dealt with the ticket takers, the vendors, the ushers, every employee in the stadium. They handled the press. They took care of dirty laundry. They handled fan complaints. It was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun too. And when the time came to go away to college, she decided to stay with the Mavericks instead of going to the University of Oregon. She talked about what a strange experience it was going from high school and seeing Bing and Kurt Russell on TV to working with them at a baseball stadium and taking on so much responsibility for the team. She said it really was like it was portrayed in the documentary, that they were in their own little world in Portland. So another woman who worked in the office was a volunteer named Kay Lesser. And even though she was a volunteer, they found a creative way to compensate her. She was provided with 1/2 gallon of vodka every 2 weeks, or when requested, whichever is the longer period of time. That shows some of their creativity. So in the 70s, there was a famous gas crisis, and the price for charter buses increased. So Bing Russell decided to buy his own bus, and he put out an ad for a bus driver. And one of the people responding was Diane Tucker. She was a bus driver for the Beaverton School District, which is a suburb of Portland. Her husband saw the ad in the newspaper and told her she should do it and that he would take care of their kids all summer. So she joined the Mavericks in 1974, and she was a huge baseball fan. She talked in the papers about how she wanted to pitch batting practice for them. And she was never allowed to do that, but she did hang out on the field with them during batting practice, shagging fly balls. And the Mavericks field manager, Frank Peters, made sure that the players respected her. He told me that he told them to respect your bus driver because when you want to take a piss, you want to make sure she's going to stop. And everything I've read about her, she sounds like a hoot. I wasn't able to track her down or find too much about her after her time with the Mavericks, but she sounds like she was fun. And that brings us to Penny Climo, the Mavericks ball girl. And Penny was among the first group of girls who were allowed to play Little League baseball. Little League had been hit with a number of lawsuits for discrimination, and eventually they gave in. So this was right around this time she got in there. She played for the South Powell Little League, and opposing players described her as one of the toughest pitchers in the league. And as a sixth grader, she was playing against seventh and eighth grade boys. She was a ball girl for 2 seasons. I'm not sure exactly how she got that job, but I imagine it was a formative experience to sit in the Mavericks dugout as a middle schooler. I asked Frank Peters about her, and he said, what you want from a ball boy or girl is to not notice them. And he said they never noticed her. So she was good at her job, but I imagine she absorbed a lot. Now, not strictly on the Mavericks, but in the league at the same time was Christine Wren, who was the second woman in umpire in organized baseball. She followed Bernice Guerra, who had fought for the right to be an umpire in baseball for years. And she finally got her shot, and she was so worn down by the legal battle that she worked one season or one game and called it a career. So Christine was the first woman to work a full season. She was hired by the Northwest League in 1975. And like a lot of these other women, she grew up wanting to be a baseball player. She wanted to be the next Mickey Mantle. That path wasn't available, so she chose being an umpire. And Frank Peters was very complimentary of her. He said, being a ball player is almost impossible. Being an umpire is even harder. And I think that speaks to what a difficult path she had. But he told me he thought she was good enough to have been a major league umpire, and that matches things he said about her in the newspaper at the time. So all good things must end, and eventually these women all left the Mavericks. Lanny Moss and Carren Woods went to Hawaii for a year. They briefly worked with the Hawaii Islanders baseball team, and they worked for Team Hawaii, which was a soccer team. Lanny came home to see her sister graduate and stopped by Mavericks tryouts and realized she really wanted to go back into baseball. So Lanny and Carren used their Northwest League connections and owned and operated an independent baseball team there, the Boise Buckskins, for one season. And that team is a story and a half all on its own. But after the Buckskins shut down, Lanny left baseball altogether. She was really outgoing with the press during her time in baseball, but afterwards, she decided she didn't want to talk about her baseball work anymore. And she declined to be part of the documentary, and she hasn't participated in any Where Are They Now newspaper articles that ran through the years with the Mavericks. And she wasn't interested in talking to me when I was researching this, but she did send me a couple pictures from a Mavericks reunion hosted by the Hillsboro Hops, which is a minor league team west of Portland. They've been hosting Mavericks reunion nights, and she showed up at one of those where she was very warmly received by everyone. And it seems like everyone has really great memories of her. After the Buckskins shut down, Woods also left baseball. She is currently a pastor at a community church in Portland. And she said it's similar to baseball in that a lot of people still don't think women should be pastors, but she just puts her head down and does the work. Christine Wren umpired through 1977, and she said in a 2020 article with the Seattle Times that it was made clear to her in a roundabout way that there was no path forward. And the Mavericks themselves were forced out of Portland after the 1977 season. Organized baseball had previously thought it couldn't make any money in Portland, but the Mavericks showed that they were wrong. So in that way, the Mavericks were kind of a victim of their own success. But it's worth looking at this moment when so many women worked for a baseball team. It was at a time when second wave feminism was making a lot of ground, and that was bleeding over into sports. Right around this time, Title IX was passed, girls were allowed to play Little League. Billie Jean King won the Battle of the Sexes, women were fighting their way into press boxes. And all of these high profile firsts had a big impact on the culture as a whole and showed that women could do these things. Um, every woman I've talked to or researched from this era didn't want to be associated with the women's liberation movement or the Libbers, as they were called. And There's a variety of reasons for this, but it mostly seemed to be that they just wanted to do the jobs they wanted to do. They didn't want to fight to do them. They didn't want to convince people they could do them. And they didn't want all the attention and publicity that came along with it. And I think Lanny really hit the nail on the head here when she said, there's been more of a reaction to me being given a title than doing a job. So, what made this moment possible was that the Mavericks wanted to be different. They didn't set out to be progressive or feminist. They just wanted to operate differently than baseball operated. And that opened them up to other people that you could hire to do jobs that were traditionally done only by one type of person. And importantly, they also offered support to all the women they hired. They talked them up, they gave them what they needed to be successful. And I think that's a really important point. It often feels like progress for women in baseball has been frustratingly slow. It's obviously better than it was in the 70s, but we still have a ways to go. And the Mavericks gave us a snapshot of how things can be, and they taught us we don't have to do things the way they've always been done. So here are some of my sources from this story. Nick Bertram covered the Mavericks for the Oregonian and did a number of really great profiles. And he wrote about the women of the Mavericks like they were people, which is unusual at the time. The Diamonds and Roses podcast has a lot of interviews with Mavericks players, if that's something you're interested in. And I talked with Frank Peters and Carren Woods, who were both really generous with their time and answered a lot of questions, told me a lot of amazing stories. And the Portland Mavericks Facebook fan page answered a lot of questions for me and pointed me towards some really fun things. So this was originally published as Lanny Moss and the Women of the Portland Mavericks at Lookout Landing a few years ago, if you're interested in reading a much longer version of this.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda. We have time for some questions, so you can either raise your hand if you know how to do the raise your hand emoji, or turn on your camera and wave at me, or just shout out your question, I'm looking in the chat. Oh, here's one. From Maureen, yes. What did the first young assistant who had wanted to go into law end up doing?
Yeah, she eventually became a pastor. She did a lot of other work. It seems it was a lot of community type work. So I guess you could see that as being pretty far removed from law.
Were you able to, did you say you'd interviewed her as well?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah,
Do you
great.
think that she became a pastor because of her relationship with Lanny, and it was an influence on her?
Possibly. They're friends to this day, so they've remained in touch, which is really cool, I think.
Yeah.
Another question is that you mentioned a player who provided some comments to you. Can you share which player that was? Are you at liberty to share that name?
Oh, about the Me Too
Um,
situation.
I'm not sure. Jason was the one asking the
Yeah,
question.
correct.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that was John Yoshiwara. And that was on a Diamonds and Roses podcast interview. He was talking about a lot of things of that nature on there. And, he it was the 70s, and that doesn't totally excuse it, but it is what it is. And they seem to be aware of it, which is nice at least.
Thank you.
Let's see, another one here about did the umpire, though she wasn't directly affiliated with the other women, was she aware at the time of the other women?
Yes, she was. And there was a really nice moment Carren told me about. She said she didn't think a lot about them being women in baseball, but she said there was a time when Christine was sitting in the office with her and Lanny, and she was like, "Look at us, the rare women in baseball, all in the same room together."
Yeah, that must have been a cool moment. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I think there was some support there. And I think as an umpire, Christine was really on her own a lot. So
Yeah.
I'm sure that was great for her to have those moments.
Yeah. We have another question. Why do you think the Mavericks history has been so well preserved compared to other minor league teams?
I think people just really loved the team and everyone associated with it. It's like this was one of the greatest times of their lives. And it's really interesting talking to people about it because it really touched everyone involved with the team and meant a lot to them.
And I'm guessing they had a lot of, public support, a lot of fans and stuff. And so, um,
Yeah.
were they, I don't know much about them, I have to admit. Were they, winning? Were they a big winning team?
Yeah, yeah, they won a lot.
That
They
helps.
played for championships in their minor league. And there weren't a lot of other sports in Portland at the time. They had an NBA team and a soccer team, but there wasn't a lot to compete for their attention. So they were well covered in the newspapers and had a
Yeah.
lot of fan support.
Yeah, that helps. And being a winning team helps too. People always, even if they're not going to games, they hear about
Mhm.
that. Reminds me of my mother becoming a giant Bears football fan when they were winning championships, even though, and then before and after, she never talked about football. So, but it gets the name out and the popularity of the team, definitely.
Mhm.
Well, are there any other questions for Amanda? Yeah, I did not know about this team, and I was a huge, probably one of millions of similar age women who had crushes on Kurt Russell when he was young and in movies and on television. So this is that was an interesting connection
Yeah,
there.
he played for the Mavericks for a
How
little
long did he
while
play for
too.
them?
It wasn't very long, maybe a season.
Yeah, yeah, because he was, I mean, he was doing TV and movies and stuff from pretty young
Mhm.
age. So I would imagine
Yeah.
taking time off to play a season of baseball might have, impinged on his career as an actor. So great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Amanda. We really appreciate
You're
your
welcome.
presentation and, good luck with your future work. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.